I'm Caroline Poland, the founder and CEO of Poland & Associates Consulting. And today we're going to dive into one of my favorite topics, which is trauma-informed workplaces and living a trauma-informed life. The reality is that trauma touches all of us. So today we're going to dive more into this series and we're going to talk a little bit about the why. So before we can jump in and really talk about the principles and integration of trauma-informed care into workplaces and classrooms and just living a trauma-informed life in general, I think we really need to understand and kind of build that foundation of why it's so important to do so, and then we'll get into the how of how to do that. I do want to mention I have a disclaimer below, but this is really just a very general kind of scratching the surface conversation, and so I'm really not giving any specific information to any individual situation or person, but what I'd like to do is invite curiosity into this conversation. So as you listen to this series, see if you can take that stance of a curious observer and a curious noticer of your own life, of your own relationships, of your own workplaces, and just be curious about where things could be switched a little bit, where things could be better, and how things could become a little bit more trauma-informed. So let's start looking at this basic framework for trauma-informed workplaces and living a trauma-informed life. Next, we need to remember that implementing trauma-informed principles and care into workplaces or classrooms is not a simple checklist. It isn't a one-time event. It's not a one-time webinar or conversation, but this is an ongoing process that needs to consistently be reevaluated, conversations to be had, and again, because society and global events are impacting individual and organizational levels of trauma, this conversation has to be ongoing. And so sometimes we like to take this approach that we've provided, the brown bag lunch that people can come in and listen to this conversation. And it's not that that conversation is bad, but if it ends there, it's not helpful. So this really needs to be ongoing, and we as organizations, as higher levels of management, as people who are kind of overseeing the structure and the organization of the classroom or the workplace, need to understand that we need to commit resources in order to implement these principles into the structure of the organization or the classroom. And again, resources aren't just financial, although of course that is part of it. But again, if you have watched some of my prior videos on burnout, we are looking kind of at the demands and the resources, and resources really need to meet and balance out the demands that we're experiencing, and trauma is part of the demands that we experience. So those resources, like I said, could be financial, but they could also be a time-based resource, a specific room or a setting within the workplace or the classroom. It could be just the general conversations that we're having. It could be the time that we're taking to make sure that someone experiences emotional regulation after a hard moment. It could be a series of different things. But we really need to commit to the ongoing process and the ongoing resources in order to effectively do this. Sometimes we fall prey to this idea that when there isn't something that's visibly wrong, then everything is going well and that things are healthy and that nothing needs to be addressed. But what we understand about health and wellness is that it's not just about the absence of the negative that leads to health and wellness. It's the actual presence of positive components in our life, in our workplaces, in our classroom, and the overall systemic structure that leads to health and wellness. And so the same thing applies when we're talking about integrating trauma-informed principles and pillars into our organizations. It's not just the absence of the negative that matters, it's the presence of positive components as we integrate this into the overall structure and organization that really matters. And again, to kind of tie that back to the fact that this is ongoing. There's adjustments that are going to be needed along the way, and there's going to need to be ongoing conversations so that we can be proactive in understanding or catching those things as they creep up. What do we need to put into place now so that we can help prevent something else down the road? So again, we're going to kind of look at this from a multiple tier organizational and individual level as we go through this series. So I want to address one of the pushbacks that I think sometimes comes up when we're talking about implementing trauma-informed principles and pillars into our organizations or classrooms, and that is that it takes time and it takes resources, and we might not feel like we have time for that. We might not feel like we have the energy for that, or that's not the purpose of the workplace. So I want to provide maybe a different option of thinking again as we're being curious and kind of wrestling through how can we creatively make this happen. And there's not a set formula to make this happen. But when we can start to incorporate this into our organizations or classrooms, when we can start living a trauma-informed life, whether at work or just in our relationships in general, it pays off in dividends. We are healthier individuals, and there are a variety of different things that happen. It's kind of a cascading effect. We can snowball in really unhealthy ways, but we can also snowball in really healthy ways as well. So whether that's increased productivity and concentration, healthier nervous systems and regulation in the workplace or the classroom, certainly better learning and changes to how we think, our productivity goes up, our bodies are healthier, so there's less missed days of work, we're just more happy in the workplace, and workplace or classroom success goes up because we are more happy to be there. And so this really, again, pays off in dividends in this cascading impact either direction, right? We kind of get to control that a little bit within the organization from the top. This is kind of a workplace culture issue that we can create a snowball effect down the organization and within the structure in positive ways, or we can kind of create that snowballing effect in negative ways as well. So throughout this series, we're going to talk about some of these guiding principles and pillars of trauma-informed care, trauma-informed workplaces, and just living a trauma-informed life in general. We're going to talk about safety and connection and trustworthiness and choices and collaboration and all of these different things that when we can kind of integrate them into the framework of our organization and how we interact from the top down and the bottom up within classrooms and workplaces, we're just going to really dive into that and talk about those things more in detail. So again, make sure that you subscribe to this channel if you haven't already so that you don't miss out on future videos, and just be really curious as you head into these next couple weeks. Start looking at your own life and your own organization and try to gain some awareness of how trauma-informed care principles are either playing out in your workplace, or what might need to change. What are some of those little adjustments along the way that could actually lead to a healthier workplace in general? You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Poland & Associates, and my website, polandassociates.com. And if you're interested in having me speak to your business or organization, there's a form on my website that you can fill out so that we can begin working together.